Good afternoon. It is Wednesday, and as has been true over the past several weeks, we will not be meeting tonight for our normal Wednesday evening Bible classes. But I am very hopeful that very soon we're going to be able to resume our normal schedule and get back to the regular schedule of Bible classes and worship. But as we are not meeting tonight, I would like to ask that you would join me for a few minutes as we look together at Psalm 77. I hope you have your Bible open and will follow along with me as we explore the words of the psalmist. As we do, I think we will see that he's struggling through some kind of a dilemma. And as he works his way through these words, he's facing some of the same questions that we often find ourselves asking. Have you ever been going through a difficult time or situation and prayed earnestly to God for His help in being delivered from the difficulty? And you found yourself feeling as though you just received no answer from God? Has there ever been a time when you believed that God had turned away from you and was perhaps ignoring your prayers? If we were to be honest, I would expect that there have been times when we've all begun to have those thoughts. Even when we know that God hears our prayers, and yet we're so overwhelmed by what is going on with us, needing desperately to feel His guidance, and that guidance is just not readily experienced, at least not in the way or in the time frame that we expect. That was apparently the feeling of the author of this psalm. The background of the psalm seems to have been a time when God had cast off His own. In spite of their continual prayers for restoration, the people had not heard from Him. The writer raises the question, why does God let oppression continue without giving any expressions of His concern? As the writer develops his thoughts throughout this psalm, he begins in a way that I think is so often how we tend to approach God with our problems and with our difficulties. It's easy for us to turn our attention to us and how we see those problems affecting us, rather than focusing on God and recognizing Him as the one who really knows how best to answer. In his approach to God in his prayer, the psalmist seems to be questioning why God has not responded to his prayer, and he's desperate for help. In the beginning of the psalm, the writer is focused more or less on himself, but in the latter part, he focuses more on God. It's interesting to notice that in the first half of this psalm, those first-person pronouns are used 22 times, while God is referred to 11 times. Then in the second half of the psalm, I is used only 3 times, while references to God appear 24 times. It's as though the psalmist begins to be somewhat consumed with his own desires. And then as he concludes, he comes to realize that his desires need to give way to God's desires. The message seems to be, and I think it's a message we all need to learn, that when we focus on ourselves, when we look at our own brokenness and our own pain, we become discouraged and gloomy. But when we focus on God, we're able to sing in the darkest night. Our disposition and our approach to our struggles is greatly affected by where we place God in our thoughts. This psalm helps us to answer the question, what do we do when we don't hear from God? The first response that we are to make, according to the psalmist, is to pray. This is an oft-repeated exhortation in the Psalms. We see this approach again and again in the writings of the Psalms, regardless of who the author of the psalm is. The writers often did not know the answers to their dilemmas, but they always knew where to turn. Let's read together from Psalm 77, the first 3 verses. The psalmist says, I cried out to God for help. I cried out to God to hear me. When I was in distress, I sought the Lord. At night, I stretched out my untiring hands, and my soul refused to be comforted. I remembered you, O God, and I groaned. I mused, and my spirit grew faint. In the very first line, we see the writer's perplexity. He cried out, praying aloud to God. He felt as though he was living through some horrendous trial, and day and night he was asking the Lord for help through this earnest prayer. He's obviously deeply troubled. He's broken and burdened. His deep anguish and anxiety are portrayed in the psalm as his whole being seems to be consumed with distress. but he did not cease to pray. In fact, he says that he prayed until he was weary of praying. He speaks of his outstretched hand seeking God, but he found no comfort. His own meditations and musings overwhelmed his spirit. Thinking of God made his spirits moan, for God's great acts in the past were not being seen at that time. In verse 11, the psalmist, remembering, changed his complaint to praise, but in verse 3, remembering only brought him to despair. While he had prayed believing that God heard him, he continued to experience sorrow and grief. Let's go to verse 4, and we read these words. You kept my eyes from closing. I was too troubled to speak. I thought about the former days, the years of long ago. I remembered my songs in the night. My heart mused, and my spirit inquired. Will the Lord reject forever? Will he never show his favor again? Has his unfailing love vanished forever? Has his promise failed for all time? Has God forgotten to be merciful? Has he in anger withheld his compassion? Have you ever been in such misery, such hopelessness, that you just cannot sleep? The psalmist speaks of how sleep fled from his eyes and how his sorrow sank into speechlessness. He was so troubled that silence descended upon him. His misery brought to mind earlier times when he had sung in the night, when he could sing while even in distress. However, the misery that he was experiencing at this time was so deep that he was unable to sing through it. That memory of encouraging days in the past added distress to the pains of the present. He finds himself searching for answers, and as he searches, he breaks into a series of questions. He's having a difficult time understanding why a God of mercy and compassion would remain silent and inactive. At least, that's the way things appear to him. 6 questions begin to come from his lips, questions that are genuine heart cries, and yet they are rhetorical questions in that they required negative answers. Those questions are, number 1, will the Lord reject forever? 2nd, will he never show his favor again? And then, has his unfailing love vanished forever? Number 4, has his promise failed for all time? Question number 5, has God forgotten to be merciful? Number 6, has he in anger withheld his compassion? In those questions, it is easy to see the anguish that the author is feeling. In his mind, he seems to have lost all confidence in God. Unfortunately, I think it's not unusual for God's present-day children to be asking, at times, the same kind of questions, or perhaps trying to understand. Of course, we know that the answer to the questions is obviously no. And yet, even though we know this, still there are times when we find ourselves having difficulty not asking the questions. And it is in the questioning that we actually find ourselves turning from our insecurities to a renewed dependence and confidence in a loving, merciful, and compassionate God. Having questioned, the psalmist follows his questions by surrender, as now he speaks of a series of commitments to remember God's works in verses 11 and 12. He says, I will remember the deeds of the Lord, the first part of verse 11. The second part of verse 11, I will remember your miracles of long ago. And then in verse 12, I will meditate on all of your works. As the psalmist continues, and as the psalm continues to think through and process what he is going through, we see him beginning to turn from self to his God. Have you ever noticed how self so often gets in the way of God? If we can just remove self from the picture and give God his rightful place, the picture will begin to look brighter and much more in focus. When we turn to God, or when the psalmist turned to God and removed himself from the forefront, the psalmist began to find faith and hope in the memory of God's past faithfulness. His real trial is seen in that it seemed to him that God had cast him aside, and he's at a very low point in his life. The only direction from the bottom is up, and from those depths of doubt, we see the psalmist begin his ascent. The second response that the psalmist describes in this psalm is to remember. We're encouraged to pray, but then to accompany our prayer with remembering what God has done in the past, and this thinking will bring you renewed confidence and hope. Look together with me at verse 10 through verse 15. And then I thought, to this I will appeal, the years of the right hand of the Most High. I will remember the deeds of the Lord. Yes, I will remember your miracles of long ago. I will meditate on all your works and consider all your mighty deeds. Your ways, O God, are holy. What God is so great as our God? You are the God who performs miracles. You display your power among the peoples. With your mighty arm, you redeemed your people, the descendants of Jacob and Joseph. We see the tone of the psalm begin to change with verse 10. Recalling the wonders of God in past days had brought hope for the psalmist. God has proved himself to be one who does glorious deeds. He has shown his strength and had redeemed the children of Israel. The unspoken request of the psalmist was that God might so act again. As you and I ponder the wonders of God, those acts that we are so familiar with in the pages of the Old Testament, we too might well be compelled to ask the question that is found in verse 13. Who is so great a God as our God? God has made known his strength and his love for his people by demonstration as well as by declaration. Verses 13, 14, and 15 sketch God's power in general terms. He is holy, great, and strong, a worker of wonders. We can know of his strength and his wonders when we recall the creation, the exodus from Egypt for his people, and how he guided them, and he kept them safe. And we remember all those great events of history that prefigure Christ and his work, blending together to bring a great work of redemption. And then the psalmist ends by writing these words in verse 16. The waters saw you, O God. The waters saw you and writhed. The very depths were convulsed. The clouds poured down water. The skies resounded with thunder. Your arrows flashed back and forth. Your thunder was heard in the whirlwind. Your lightning lit up the world. The earth trembled and quaked. Your path led through the sea, your way through the mighty waters, though your footprints were not seen. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. This verse seems to take the mind of the reader as well as the thought of the writer back to the time when God delivered his children through the Red Sea and to safety from Pharaoh's army. The dominant note in this section is God's power over nature in general, as God leads the children of Israel from the terror and the mystery of the crossing of the Red Sea and into the wonderful example of the wonder of God's care for his people, much like a shepherd would care for his flock. The psalmist speaks of the thunder and lightning and the rain, but the honor goes to God. As we have seen the progression of the thoughts of the psalmist through this psalm, assurance of God's leadership has been renewed in the heart of the writer. He allows himself to realize that it was God who led his people, and that he will continue to take care of his people. The third response found in this psalm is trust. It's not specifically mentioned, but it is definitely implied. No answer to the psalmist's prayer is mentioned at the end of the psalm, but it's evident that he has developed a new attitude toward his situation. He would trust in God to do what he saw best. God has never failed his people in the past. And regardless of how matters might look, and regardless of how long a situation remains unchanged, God does not and will not ever forget his people. Although this psalm was written from the valley of suffering, there is an air of encouragement within its words. It encourages the downhearted by looking toward the exalted God. If it has not already done so, there may come a time in your life when you will descend into a pit of trouble. And when as you approach God asking him to deliver you, and that deliverance does not seem to come as soon as you might think, what are you going to do? Never allow yourself to forget God's goodness, and know that he will not abandon or forsake his people. And perhaps we should think about it in this way. If God does not answer our prayers as we think he should, that is because he's busy answering our prayers the way he thinks he should. Would you pray with me? God, help us to always know that you understand our needs, that you love us, and that you want us to be a people who rely on you. And Father, when we know that you haven't answered our prayers just in the way that we would want them answered, we're thankful that you hear, and we're thankful that you will answer the best that you know how and what is best for us. Father, thank you for loving us. Thank you for allowing us to be a part of the church here in Lamesa, and guide us as we look toward an opportunity to return once again to studying the Bible and worshiping here at our building. Again, be with us, and thank you for your wonderful love. I pray these things in the name of Christ. Amen.